Every night, as modern Rome glows under street lamps and restless traffic, scientists still puzzle over why the earliest Romans deliberately built atop layers of older settlements, almost as if they were trying to hide or preserve clues about how a minor hilltop village became the nucleus of one of history's most unstoppable civilizations. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. The Palatine Hill rests quietly today, yet beneath its soil lie remnants of huts dating to the mid-8th century BCE, suggesting a community that had already mastered the practical art of survival long before any grand stories were written about it. Archaeologists uncovered the so-called Hut of Romulus, a modest oval structure with wattle and daub walls. And although no one can prove it belonged to an actual founder, its existence aligns uncannily with early Roman traditions. The village was small, simple, and unpretentious, but the location surrounded by defensible hills near a fordable point of the Tiber and positioned between Etruscan lands and Latin tribes, placed it at a crossroads of both opportunity and danger. The earliest Romans seemed to understand geography as destiny settling not in the calmest spot, but in the most strategic one, a pattern the city would replicate over its entire history. The old tales describe 7 kings, beginning with Romulus, whose reign supposedly commenced in 753 BCE, a date engraved deeply into Roman identity. Whether Romulus existed as a real leader, a composite figure, or a symbolic reminder of tribal unification, the political structure attributed to him reflects something historically plausible: a chief who united fractious hill settlements into a single polity. Kingship in early Rome wasn't the grand monarchy later emperors would display. It was more like the chiefdoms of neighboring Italic peoples, where military leadership, priestly duties, and judicial roles were merged into one office. 3 early kings were said to be Latin, 3 Sabine, and 1 Etruscan, mirroring the ethnically blended archaeological record that hints at trade intermarriage and cultural fusion rather than isolation. Under Numa Pompilius, the second king, Roman religion took on shape and structure, with rituals, sacred calendars, and priesthoods formalized into systems that would endure for centuries. Whether Numa was a historical person or a philosophical creation retroactively inserted to explain Rome's elaborate ritual life, the institutions attributed to him had real staying power. Romans built their identity around the idea that discipline wasn't just for soldiers, but for the gods, the law, and time itself. Temples rose along the hilltops, including early shrines that later generations quietly rebuilt, expanded, and polished into structures of marble grandeur. Yet behind the later magnificence, the earliest layers remained simple post holes, hearths, and clay altars, speaking softly of people who viewed order as the only antidote to a harsh, unpredictable world. Tullus Hostilius, the third king, expanded Rome through conflict rather than culture, pushing its influence toward the Alban Hills. Ancient sources love recounting the duel of the Horati and Curiati, a dramatic contest meant to decide the fate of both cities through ritualized combat. Historians debate whether such a duel ever happened, but its symbolic meaning captures something real. Early Rome resolved territorial disputes through limited warfare negotiations and displays of controlled violence. The archaeological record shows fortified settlements and burned layers around this period, suggesting conflicts did erupt across the region as different Italic groups fought for land and dominance. Rome was neither the largest nor the most powerful at first, but it had an unusual combination of adaptability and stubbornness that would become its signature trait. The next king, Ancus Marcius, supposedly blended the legacies of both Numa and Tullus, uniting religious order with military expansion. His name is associated with Rome's move toward the sea, including the founding of Ostia at the Tiber's mouth. Whether he truly built a port city that early remains debated, but trade evidence, Greek pottery, Etruscan jewelry, and metalwork appears in archaeological layers from around the 7th century BCE, suggesting Rome was already plugging itself into wider Mediterranean networks. A village beginning to trade with the foreign world is a village preparing for transformation, even if the people living there had no idea what that transformation would eventually become. Tarquin the Elder, an Etruscan, according to tradition, marks a turning point. His era reflects the growing influence of the sophisticated Etruscan cities north of Rome. Their art engineering and political organization seeped into Roman life like dye into cloth. The construction of the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's oldest sewer systems, is attributed to this period, transforming swampy lowlands between the hills into usable public space. This engineering feat alone hints at a society increasingly capable of solving large-scale problems and planning for future generations. It also suggests a population dense enough to require major public works. Rome was no longer just a cluster of huts, but a growing small city. Servius Tullius, credited with introducing the first census and dividing citizens into classes based on wealth, gently nudged Rome toward the political system that would one day evolve into the Republic. Whether Servius truly invented this or merely formalized older practices, the reforms reflected the realities of a changing society. Rome needed to classify people not just for taxation, but for military duty, political voting, and social identity. The city was shifting from a kin-based society to one structured by institutions and bureaucracy. And this early experiment in class organization laid groundwork for centuries of political tension, negotiation, and reform. The last king, Tarquin the Proud, is remembered for tyranny, arrogance, and an overreaching ambition that alienated Rome's elite families. The story of his downfall hinges on the tragic event involving Lucretia, whose assault by the king's son sparked outrage, collective vows, and the abolition of monarchy around 509 BCE. Whether the incident unfolded precisely as later writers described isn't verifiable, but something significant did happen. Rome replaced hereditary kings with elected magistrates, creating a republic unlike anything else in Italy at that time. The transition, peaceful in some accounts, violent in others, marks the tangible beginning of Rome as the city that would dominate the Western world. The moment the kings vanished from Rome's political landscape, the city stepped into a complicated experiment in shared governance that blended idealism with raw anxiety. Power no longer flowed from a single throne, but instead moved through two annually elected consuls who were meant to check one another, a delicate arrangement born from fear of tyranny. These early consuls held military, judicial, and civic authority, yet their inability to act alone created a constant balancing act that the Roman elite viewed as both a safeguard and a potential weakness. The Senate an assembly of elders whose roots stretched back into the monarchy, gained greater influence, operating as a guiding council that shaped policy, war strategy, and foreign relationships. And surrounding all of this was the citizen body itself, structured into assemblies that voted on laws, elected magistrates, and supplied the manpower that would soon transform Rome into a regional force. Despite the new political order, Rome's early republic was far from stable. Tensions between the patricians, the aristocratic families claiming descent from Rome's earliest clans, and the plebeians, the broader body of common citizens, simmered beneath every decision. Patricians held nearly all meaningful offices and religious roles, controlling legal knowledge, land distribution, and the social networks that defined status. Plebeians, though essential to Rome's military strength and economic survival, found themselves blocked from upward mobility. This imbalance triggered what later writers called the struggle of the orders, a long and evolving conflict that shaped Roman law identity and political culture. In the early 5th century BCE, the plebeians staged a dramatic protest by seceding from the city and camping on a nearby hill until their demands were taken seriously. This collective action shocked the patricians, who suddenly faced the reality of an empty city and no army to defend it. The compromise reached in response established the office of the tribune of the plebs officials, elected solely by plebeians with the power to veto decisions they deemed harmful to their class. The tribunes quickly became one of Rome's most formidable political forces, shielded by sacrosanct status that made it a religious crime to harm them. Their existence introduced a fascinating paradox. Although Rome distrusted individual power, the Republic repeatedly granted extraordinary authority to individuals, as long as those powers seemed protective rather than tyrannical. Rome's political experiments unfolded alongside a series of fierce conflicts with neighboring Latin, Etruscan, and Italic communities. The fledgling Republic fought off Etruscan attempts to restore the monarchy, resisted incursions from hill tribes, and navigated a shifting maze of alliances with Latin cities. These wars were often small in scale, but constant, teaching Romans the value of disciplined military organization, strategic alliances, and adaptive tactics. Success depended not just on raw force, but on Rome's ability to absorb outsiders into its identity, extending forms of limited citizenship to allied communities while demanding military service and loyalty in return. This pragmatic inclusivity, sometimes generous, sometimes strategic, to the point of cold calculation, became a cornerstone of Roman expansion. Amid this backdrop of warfare and political development, one legislative milestone stands out: the creation of the 12 Tables in the mid-5th century BCE. Plebeian pressure for legal transparency pushed the state to carve Rome's laws onto bronze tablets and display them publicly. This early codification covered issues ranging from property rights to family authority, defining penalties for theft, debt, and violence in blunt, sometimes harsh terms. Though simple by later standards, the 12 Tables provided a foundation for Roman legal tradition and reflected a society struggling to balance order with fairness. Historians continue to debate which parts represent true early law and which parts were later additions. Yet the central idea, a society governed by known written rules, carried forward into Roman identity and influenced Western law for millennia. By the late 5th and early 4th centuries, BCE Rome was strong enough to assert leadership in the Latin League, but still vulnerable to sudden catastrophe. That vulnerability became painfully clear in 390 BCE when a Gallic force under a chieftain named Brennus descended into central Italy and defeated Roman forces at the river Allia. The city fell shortly after its temples looted, its homes burned, and its survivors forced to retreat to the fortified Capitoline Hill. The sack left psychological scars that Roman writers later magnified into a defining trauma. Whether the destruction was as complete as tradition claims remains uncertain. Archaeological evidence is mixed, but the impact on Roman memory was enormous. Brennus's supposed declaration, Vae Victis, meaning woe to the conquered, echoed across centuries, representing everything Rome feared about losing control. Yet Rome recovered, with astonishing speed, rebuilding fortifications, reorganizing its defenses, and using the disaster as a justification for further dominance over its neighbors. One of the most consequential developments was the construction of the Servian Wall, an enormous defensive barrier that enclosed the enlarged city and symbolized Rome's determination to prevent humiliation from ever happening again. Military reforms reshaped the infantry into a more flexible structure, gradually shifting from rigid aristocratic cavalry to the heavily armed infantry legions that would one day dominate the Mediterranean. Romans learned not only from their own failures, but also from observing the strengths and weaknesses of their enemies, borrowing equipment, tactics, and strategies from Samnites, Etruscans, and Greek mercenaries. With remarkable pragmatism, the 4th century BCE brought Rome into a series of grueling wars with the Samnites, a formidable mountain people who fought with agility, strategic cunning, and intimate knowledge of rugged terrain. These conflicts stretched for decades, forcing Rome to adapt everything from its formations to its logistics. The infamous Caudine Forks episode, where a Roman army was trapped in a narrow valley and forced to pass under a humiliating yoke, left a mark similar to the Gallic sack, a reminder that Rome's rise was not smooth or inevitable, but punctuated by hard lessons. Yet each setback led to new reforms, including more standardized equipment, strengthened alliances, and an increasingly professionalized military culture. Rome's resilience during the Samnite Wars helps explain why, by the end of the 4th century, it emerged as the dominant power in central Italy. Alongside military confrontations, internal politics remained turbulent. Tribunes pushed for broader rights, land reforms, and debt relief. Patricians sought to maintain privilege while also recognizing that Rome could not expand effectively without social cohesion and manpower. Over time, plebeians gained access to the consulship, priesthoods, and high political office, culminating in the Licinian Sextian reforms of 367 BCE. These changes reduced social inequality, at least in theory, and established a shared ruling class composed of both old patrician families and newly elevated plebeian elites. Though class conflict never fully disappeared, the Republic's ability to integrate competing interests contributed to its longevity. The surprising element is how quickly Rome transitioned from survival mode to expansion after these developments. Within a few generations, the city that once feared Etruscan restoration and Gallic raids now influenced most of the Italian peninsula. Its success cannot be attributed solely to military might. Rome mastered the delicate art of alliance building. Conquered or allied communities often retained local autonomy, but were bound to Rome through treaties requiring military support. In return, Rome offered varying degrees of citizenship, legal protection, and economic integration. This system created a vast network of communities tied to Rome's fortunes, allowing the Republic to muster enormous armies unmatched by rivals. Rome approached the dawn of the 3rd century BCE with momentum that had been sharpened through hardship, reshaped by institutional reform, and reinforced by an increasingly sophisticated approach to war and diplomacy. The city no longer saw itself as a vulnerable settlement surviving among stronger neighbors. It now understood its strength as a product of collective discipline and the ability to adapt to almost any circumstance. Italian communities, Latin, Sabine, Oscan, Etruscan, and Greek, lived under a patchwork of alliances with Rome, some voluntary, some imposed, but all tied to Rome's expanding influence through obligations of military service and shared defense. This network created a vast reservoir of manpower that Rome could call upon, something its rivals found impossible to match. And as roads spread across the peninsula, the Republic could move armies faster, supply them more reliably, and sustain campaigns with a level of organization that hinted at a much larger future. The Samnite Wars had taught Rome how to maneuver in mountain terrain, how to respond to guerrilla tactics, and how to remain patient through setbacks. By absorbing the lessons of defeat rather than avoiding them, Rome developed a tactical mindset rooted in resilience. The manipular formation, flexible lines of cohorts arranged in staggered blocks, gave Roman legions the ability to fight effectively on uneven ground and to rotate fresh troops into the front lines with speed and precision. To many later observers, it is striking how quickly this formation replaced older phalanx-style battle lines common in much of the Mediterranean. The shift demonstrated not only military intelligence, but also Rome's capacity to change core traditions, when doing so enhanced survival and dominance. The legions of this era were still citizen armies rather than professional soldiers, yet their training equipment standardization and strict discipline made them formidable. While Roman power expanded, Italy itself remained culturally varied. Greek colonies like Tarentum and Neapolis maintained deep connections with the wider Hellenic world, bringing literature, art, and philosophy into Italy, even as Rome often viewed them with suspicion. Etruscan cities, though declining from earlier greatness, still influenced architecture, religion, and urban planning. Sabine and Oscan communities preserved old Italic customs that blended slowly into Roman life as citizenship or semi-citizenship spread. This multicultural environment shaped Rome's worldview. Though the Republic remained deeply traditional, it gradually absorbed foreign ideas, sometimes eagerly, sometimes reluctantly. This absorption was selective and strategic. Romans admired Greek education, but distrusted Greek. Luxury valued Etruscan engineering, but resisted Etruscan political dominance. These cultural negotiations became central to how Rome built a cohesive Italy under its leadership. The trigger that pushed Rome from dominance in Italy to engagements across the Mediterranean came from the southern Greek city of Tarentum. Concerned about Roman influence and protective of its autonomy, Tarentum clashed with Roman vessels sailing into its territory, escalating tension into open war. Recognizing its inability to resist Rome alone, Tarentum called upon King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a highly ambitious ruler with dreams of carving out his own Western Empire. Pyrrhus landed in Italy in 280 BCE with a well-trained Hellenistic army, including elephants' phalanxes and experienced cavalry. His arrival marked a new phase in Roman warfare. For the first time, the Republic faced a commander trained in the successor states of Alexander the Great, bringing with him strategies and resources Rome had never encountered. The battles that followed were hard-fought and costly. At Heraclea and Asculum, Pyrrhus defeated the Romans but suffered devastating losses, giving rise to the expression Pyrrhic victory, meaning triumph bought at unsustainable cost. The Romans, unlike many Hellenistic armies, replaced losses quickly thanks to their vast allied manpower. Each defeat tested their determination, but did not break their resolve. Pyrrhus, though admired for his brilliance, struggled with logistics, lacked consistent support from southern Italian communities, and discovered that Rome could absorb punishment in ways he did not expect. The most striking observation came from Pyrrhus himself, who reportedly remarked that another such victory would ruin him. After a final inconclusive campaign in Sicily and another return to Italy, Pyrrhus eventually withdrew, leaving Tarentum isolated. By 272 BCE, Rome captured the city, completing its control over nearly the entire Italian peninsula. The removal of Pyrrhus did more than end a conflict. It signaled that Rome could withstand the full power of a Hellenistic-style army and emerge stronger. This outcome impressed foreign observers, alarming some and intriguing others. Here was a city that recovered from disasters, outlasted brilliant generals, and held its alliances together under intense pressure. Many historians see this moment as a turning point where Rome shifted from being a regional power to a rising force recognized across the Mediterranean. With Italy largely unified under its influence, Rome began laying the groundwork for long-term stability. Colonies were founded at strategic locations, acting as military outposts and population relief valves for citizens seeking new land. Roads continued to stretch across the peninsula, connecting distant settlements to Rome and enabling fast troop movement, the Latin Rite. A special intermediate form of citizenship allowed Rome to integrate allied communities, gradually giving them legal privileges without granting full political influence. This strategy created loyalty through practical benefits while preserving Roman control. In effect, Rome built a federation that felt more cohesive than any previous Italian power structure, binding a culturally diverse population with laws, trade, and military cooperation. Yet beneath the surface, unresolved conflicts persisted. Land distribution favored elite families, debt crises surfaced repeatedly, and social mobility remained restricted despite earlier reforms. Plebeians sought further access to office, more protection from exploitation, and clearer pathways to wealth. The Republic's political machinery functioned, but the strain increased as Rome expanded its territory and responsibilities. Moreover, the Italian allies, the Socii, contributed heavily to Rome's military success, but lacked equal political representation. Their loyalty held for now, but the seeds of future tension were quietly planted. The overall picture was one of strength. The Romans believed they were guided by a combination of divine favor, ancestral virtue, and disciplined order virtues. They felt distinguished them from peoples who governed through luxury monarchy or impulsive ambition. Their sense of moral superiority, whether justified or not, fueled confidence in their system and justified expansion in their eyes. They viewed their alliances as partnerships rooted in law and duty, even when those alliances were tilted heavily in Rome's favor. Rome's command of Italy placed it directly in the path of Carthage, a wealthy maritime republic whose influence stretched across North Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, southern Spain, and crucial ports throughout the western Mediterranean. Carthage was older, richer, and far more connected to global trade networks than Rome, its harbors filled with merchants, its warehouses stocked with goods from far-off coasts, and its government built around a sophisticated oligarchy of merchant elites. The two powers had coexisted uneasily for generations, signing treaties when convenient and ignoring them when inconvenient, but Sicily, fertile, strategically positioned, and divided into quarrelsome Greek city-states, became the island where both powers finally collided. Neither side originally intended a massive war, yet a local dispute in Messana spiraled rapidly, pulling Rome and Carthage into a conflict that neither could easily withdraw from without appearing weak. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE and demonstrated that Rome's determination could be just as powerful at sea as it was on land, even though the Republic had almost no naval tradition. Carthage commanded fleets that had dominated Mediterranean waters for centuries. Rome possessed determination, engineering talent, and a stubborn disregard for the idea of impossibility. When Roman generals realized they needed ships, they simply built hundreds of them, reverse engineering a captured Carthaginian quinquereme and producing an entire fleet from scratch. The Romans then added a boarding device called the corvus, a heavy spike dropped onto enemy decks that allowed legionaries to convert naval engagements into infantry battles. This adaptation surprised Carthaginian admirals who were accustomed to fast maneuvers, ramming tactics, and long-standing mastery of the sea. Yet the Romans, by turning sea battles into infantry clashes, played to their strongest advantage. The war stretched on for more than 2 decades, exhausting both sides. Battles were lost, fleets were sunk, storms tore apart armadas, and Sicily became a graveyard for armies. Through all of this, Rome displayed a capacity to endure disasters that shocked foreign observers. When a storm destroyed an entire fleet of more than 200 ships, Rome simply built another. When generals failed, new ones replaced them. When setbacks mounted, the Senate maintained unbroken resolve to continue until victory was undeniable. Carthage fought fiercely, but its armies were largely composed of mercenaries, soldiers, whose loyalty was tied to pay and who sometimes mutinied when wages were delayed. Rome, with its citizen soldiers and allied contingents, could call upon deeper reserves of manpower, though at immense human cost. In 241 BCE, Carthage finally sought peace, ceding Sicily, the first territory outside Italy, to fall under Roman control and paying a heavy indemnity. Yet this peace was unstable from the start. Carthage's treasury, strained by war and debt, triggered a massive mercenary revolt in North Africa, one of the most brutal conflicts in its history. Hamilcar Barca, a brilliant general of noble lineage, crushed the rebellion, and soon afterward led Carthage's expansion into Spain, building a semi-autonomous Barcid dominion that produced silver wealth, fierce warriors, and a new opportunity for Carthage to rise again. The Barcid presence in Spain alarmed Rome, especially as Carthaginian influence grew among Iberian tribes. The city of Saguntum, aligned with Rome, became a flashpoint when Hannibal, Hamilcar's son, raised in war camps and sworn since childhood to resist Rome, besieged it in 219 BCE. Rome demanded his surrender. Carthage refused. The Senate declared war, and the Second Punic War, began a conflict that would become one of the most dramatic military struggles of the ancient world. Hannibal's decision to march from Spain into Italy remains one of history's boldest military maneuvers. Instead of relying solely on naval transport, he chose a land route that brought him through Gaul across raging rivers and over the Alps, a crossing so treacherous that ancient writers treated it almost like myth. Modern historians debate the exact path he took, whether through the Little St. Bernard Pass, the Montgenèvre route, or another rugged corridor. But all agree the journey was staggering. Hannibal led elephants, cavalry, and tens of thousands of infantry through icy passes, avalanches, and hostile tribes, emerging into northern Italy with a battered but still battle-ready force. That he succeeded at all is astonishing. That he succeeded and then began winning battles against Rome on its home soil is even more remarkable. The early battles Trebia in 218 BCE and Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE showcased Hannibal's talent for using terrain deception and timing to devastating effect. At Trebia, he ambushed Roman forces in freezing conditions, draining their strength before delivering the final blow. At Trasimene, he orchestrated one of the largest ambushes ever recorded, trapping Roman legions between the lake and the hills, leaving them little room to maneuver. Panic overwhelmed the Roman army, and thousands fell. These defeats shocked a republic unaccustomed to foreign invaders marching freely across its territory. Yet Rome responded, not by negotiating, but by adapting, once again appointing Fabius Maximus as dictator. He adopted a cautious strategy of avoiding direct battles, focusing instead on harassment, scorched earth tactics, and slow attrition. But the greatest crisis came in 216 BCE at Cannae, where Hannibal executed a tactical masterpiece that remains studied in military academies around the world. Facing a Roman force potentially as large as 80,000 to 90,000 men, Hannibal arranged his troops in a concave formation designed to envelop the dense Roman mass as it pushed forward. The trap worked with deadly precision. The Romans, confident in their numerical superiority, advanced aggressively, only to be surrounded as Hannibal's African infantry pivoted inward and his cavalry crushed Roman flanks. The result was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed in a single day, including many senators and elite officers. It was one of the worst defeats Rome ever suffered. And yet the Republic did not surrender. Instead, Rome enacted an extraordinary societal mobilization. New legions were raised, slaves were armed and promised freedom, and the city's allies were pressed harder than ever for support. Many Italian states remained loyal, despite Hannibal's presence, a loyalty that historians still analyze with fascination. Why did so many stay with Rome after Cannae? Some cite Rome's consistent enforcement of treaties. Others credit the benefits of Roman citizenship or partial citizenship. Still others point to fear of retribution or lack of trust in Carthage's long-term plans. Whatever the reason, Rome's alliances did not collapse even when Hannibal seemed unbeatable. Gradually, the momentum shifted. Hannibal lacked reinforcements from Carthage, whose political factions debated endlessly and hesitated to fully commit resources. Rome adapted by striking Carthaginian holdings elsewhere, especially in Spain, where young commanders like Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus, demonstrated bold talent. By 216 BC, Rome controlled Spain. By 214 BC, Scipio landed in North Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal. The two generals met at Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio's reformed tactics and superior cavalry support overwhelmed Hannibal's army. Carthage sued for peace, again, surrendering its fleet, paying another enormous indemnity, and agreeing to harsh terms that limited its ability to wage war. Rome emerged from the Punic Wars, transformed, militarily unstoppable, economically enriched, and increasingly entangled in the affairs of a Mediterranean world that stretched from the pillars of the western seas to the temples of the Greek East. Victory over Carthage had reshaped Roman confidence, convincing the Republic that its system, its gods, and its people were destined to arbitrate the fate of nations. But expansion brought new burdens. Governing Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Spain required magistrates' troops, tax systems, and supply chains. Rome had not originally designed its institutions to run overseas provinces. It had designed them to run a city-state. The mismatch between ancient political structures and new imperial responsibilities set off a century of adjustment, sometimes smooth, often chaotic. As Roman influence extended into Spain, the Republic discovered that the region was far from a monolithic prize. Iberia was home to fiercely independent tribes, fortified hill settlements, and warriors skilled in ambush warfare. Roman generals struggled for decades to impose control facing repeated uprisings. The Celtiberian and Lusitanian Wars dragged on, marked by negotiations that collapsed, treaties that changed, and commanders who alternated between leniency and brutality. One rebel leader, Viriathus, became a symbol of resistance, defeating Roman forces multiple times before being assassinated by traitors, a killing that Rome later denied orchestrating, though many historians suspect its involvement. Spain offered both wealth and hardship, revealing how difficult it was to manage distant territories through annual magistracies that rotated far too quickly for long-term stability. While Rome wrestled with Iberia, its gaze shifted towards the Greek world. Macedon, under the Antigonid dynasty, still commanded respect as a successor to Alexander the Great's legacy. Greek city-states continued to compete for influence, forming alliances, breaking them, and appealing to powerful neighbors for support. Rome entered Greek affairs initially as an ally, responding to calls for help from cities threatened by Macedonian expansion. Yet each intervention deepened Roman entanglement. The First Macedonian War, 215–205 BCE, was inconclusive, fought partly while Rome was also struggling with Hannibal. But after the Second Punic War, Rome confronted King Philip V of Macedon directly in 197 BCE at the Battle of Kynoskephali. Roman manipular flexibility triumphed over the Macedonian phalanx, a symbolic turning point where the military model of classical Greece yielded to the tactical adaptability of the legions. Rome proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks, a slogan that sounded generous, but also cemented Rome's presence in the region. Yet Greek independence under Roman protection proved complicated. Greek politics were notoriously fractious, and Rome's attempts to act as arbiter often pulled it deeper into disputes. The Seleucid king Antiochus III, attempting to extend eastward influence into Greece, challenged Rome's growing dominance. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE, where Scipio, Africanus's brother, defeated Antiochus decisively. The Treaty of Apamea forced the Seleucids to withdraw from Asia Minor, marking another major shift in the region's balance of power. Rome's involvement was expanding, not because of a coordinated imperial plan, but because each conflict created new obligations, new alliances, and new perceived threats. By the mid-2nd century, BCE Rome had fought 3 Macedonian wars, crushed the Achaean League, dismantled Corinth in a show of overwhelming force, and positioned itself as the de facto hegemon over the Greek world. The destruction of Corinth in 146 BCE, the same year Carthage fell, symbolized the end of major resistance in both East and West. Rome now controlled or influenced Spain, Greece, Anatolia, North Africa, and vast swaths of the Mediterranean coastline. It also absorbed enormous cultural imports. Greek art, sculpture, literature, philosophy, and luxury goods flooded into Roman society, reshaping elite tastes. Educated Greek slaves became tutors for aristocratic children. Roman religion began absorbing Greek myths, merging deities and rituals until Roman temples echoed Hellenic influences. This cultural blend enriched Roman life, but also introduced anxieties. Conservative Romans complained that Greek luxury was corrupting old virtues, softening Roman discipline, and undermining ancestral simplicity. Conquest also amplified economic inequality within Rome. Wealthy senators and equestrians accumulated massive estates using slave labor imported from conquered regions. Small farmers, who formed the backbone of Rome's early legions, struggled as their livelihoods collapsed under competition from slave-powered agriculture. Many sold their land and migrated to the city, forming a growing urban population in search of work and stability. The influx of wealth generated extravagant lifestyles among the elite, visible in lavish villas, private banquets, and expensive entertainments. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans faced rising rents, economic insecurity, and limited political influence beyond their votes in assemblies often dominated by elite patronage. Historiographically, the question remains, did Rome expand intentionally, driven by a coherent imperial vision, or was its growth reactive, shaped by defensive concerns and opportunistic treaties? Some scholars argue that Roman leaders believed offensive action was the best form of defense, removing potential threats before they grew serious. Others suggest Rome stumbled into empire through a series of short-term responses that accumulated into long-term domination. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Rome's culture prized honor, victory, and loyalty to allies, making it difficult for the Republic to disengage from conflicts once involved. Each war created new obligations, and each victory encouraged further expansion. The absorption of Hellenistic kingdoms accelerated after the death of Attalus III of Pergamon in 133 BCE, when he willed his kingdom to Rome. This unexpected inheritance created the new province of Asia, introducing Romans to the complexities of administering wealthy but politically intricate regions. Tax collection in these provinces was often outsourced to publicani private contractors who frequently exploited local populations. Reports of abuse traveled back to Rome, but the Republic lacked the administrative machinery to regulate provincial governance effectively. Senators held proconsular or pro-praetorian governorships for short terms, often focusing on personal enrichment rather than long-term development. Corruption became widespread, reflecting how strained Roman institutions had become under the weight of empire. The island of Rhodes, once a powerful maritime force, attempted to mediate conflicts between Rome and Macedon. Rome responded with suspicion, stripping Rhodes of territory and undercutting its influence. It became increasingly clear that Rome tolerated no rival intentional or accidental within its expanding domain. Yet even as Rome acted forcefully abroad, internal divisions deepened at home. The wealth gap widened, political competition intensified, and the Republic's traditional power-sharing mechanisms began to show signs of strain. Many Romans worried that empire, far from preserving the Republic, was quietly reshaping it from within, concentrating power in fewer hands and turning victory into a destabilizing force. The strains within Rome, long accumulating beneath the surface, began pressing visibly against the Republic's political framework as the 2nd century BC drew toward its close. Conquest had enriched Rome beyond imagination, but wealth did not flow evenly. Elite families expanded their estates using slave labor imported from defeated regions, while small farmers, the men who once filled the legions and defined Roman identity, struggled to compete. Many lost their land, drifted into the city, and joined a swelling population of urban poor, dependent on grain distributions, odd labor, and political patronage. Rome's assemblies still claimed to represent the people, but the voice of ordinary citizens had grown faint beneath the weight of senatorial alliances, wealthy patrons, and political bargaining. The Republic stood victorious abroad, yet increasingly fractured at home. Amid this tension, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus stepped onto the political stage in 133 BCE as tribune of the plebs. He proposed a land reform aimed at redistributing public land illegally held by elite families, restoring small farms, and strengthening the citizen base. His plan challenged the entrenched power of wealthy landowners who feared both economic loss and the political influence Tiberius might gain by becoming a champion of the masses. The Senate resisted fiercely, leading Tiberius to bypass traditional procedures and appeal directly to the popular assembly. This move broke with unwritten norms that balanced power between Senate and people. When Tiberius sought re-election, another break with tradition, his opponents accused him of aiming at tyranny. Violence erupted on the Capitoline Hill, and Tiberius was killed along with many supporters, marking the first major political bloodshed in Rome since the early Republic. The Senate's reaction to Tiberius shocked many Romans. A tribune supposedly protected by sacred law had been murdered by political rivals, exposing the fragility of institutions meant to prevent exactly such chaos. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, continued the reformist agenda. He introduced a wider array of proposals, subsidized grain for the poor new colonies, for resettlement, judicial reforms, reducing senatorial control over courts, and measures to weaken elite dominance. Gaius proved charismatic, intelligent, and relentless, drawing both admiration and fear. The Senate countered with its own strategies, including the Senatus Consultum, Ultimum, an emergency decree granting consuls extraordinary authority. When tensions escalated, violence erupted again. Gaius, cornered on the Aventine Hill, died during the conflict, or by his own hand, and hundreds of his followers were executed afterward. The Gracchian era revealed deep structural problems. The Republic lacked mechanisms to solve crises peacefully. Once politics turned personal, and traditional norms crumbled whenever they obstructed powerful factions. After the Gracchi, political rivalry became more aggressive, reforms more contentious, and the Senate more willing to use force. The Republic still functioned, but the quiet consensus that had once defined Roman governance was eroding. These domestic fractures coincided with external challenges. In North Africa, the wealthy kingdom of Numidia was ruled by Jugurtha, whose conflicts with rival claimants spilled across Roman interests. Jugurtha bribed Roman officials, manipulated diplomatic negotiations, and used Rome's internal divisions to delay intervention. The scandal revealed embarrassing corruption in the Senate, especially when Jugurtha reportedly declared that Rome was a city for sale. Eventually, the war escalated, and Rome sent more competent commanders, including Gaius Marius, a talented general from Arpinum with a reputation for discipline and effectiveness. Marius's rise marked a dramatic shift. He was a novus homo, a new man with no senatorial ancestry, yet he would become one of Rome's most influential figures. During the Jugurthine War, Marius reorganized Rome's army, accelerating reforms that had already begun informally. Traditionally, soldiers had to own property, but economic decline among small farmers forced Rome to recruit poorer citizens. Marius embraced this change, allowing landless men to join the legions, equipping them with state-provided gear, and creating professional long-term soldiers with strong loyalty to their commanders. This shift solved short-term manpower shortages, but carried long-term consequences. Soldiers increasingly viewed their commanders, not the Senate, as the source of their rewards, a development that empowered generals and destabilized the Republic's balance of authority. After defeating Jugurtha in cooperation with his skilled questor, Lucius Cornelius Sulla Marius became a hero. He rose again during the invasion of Italy by migrating Cimbri and Teutones from northern Europe. These tribes defeated several Roman armies, alarming the Republic, which turned once more to Marius. In battles at Aquae Sextiae, 102 BCE, and Vercelli, 101 BCE, he annihilated the invaders, earning his place as one of Rome's most celebrated commanders. Yet these victories deepened rivalry with Sulla, who felt slighted by Marius's political maneuvering during the Jugurthine campaigns. Their feud would grow into a conflict that reshaped the Republic. At the same time, Italy itself trembled under the weight of political inequality. Rome had built its power with the support of Italian allies, the Soci, who fought Rome's wars, but lacked full citizenship. These communities demanded equal rights, and Rome consistently refused. The social war erupted in 91 BCE, when allied cities rebelled, forming their own confederation with a capital at Corfinium and a constitution modeled on Rome's. The conflict was fierce and destructive, costing the Republic enormous manpower. Eventually, Rome conceded the core demands, granting citizenship to loyal communities and later to most insurgents. The war ended with Italy unified politically, but the expansion of citizenship brought new administrative burdens, new voters, and new political dynamics. The aftermath of the social war collided violently with the rivalry between Marius and Sulla. When Mithridates VI of Pontus seized Roman territory in the east and orchestrated a massacre of tens of thousands of Romans and Italians in Asia Minor, Rome prepared a major military response. The Senate assigned the command to Sulla, but Marius, using popular support, maneuvered to have it transferred to himself. In a shocking turn, Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, something no Roman general had ever done, driving out Marius and seizing control. This act shattered another taboo. Rome's own legions, meant to protect the state, had been used against it. Sulla departed for the east, fought Mithridates, and returned years later to confront Marius's faction, which had reclaimed power in his absence. The resulting civil war was brutal. Sulla emerged victorious, declared himself dictator, and launched proscriptions lists of enemies marked for execution, their property confiscated, their families exiled. These killings terrorized Rome and demonstrated how the Republic's institutions could be twisted into tools of personal vengeance. Sulla then enacted reforms aimed at strengthening senatorial authority and limiting the power of tribunes, attempting to restore an older version of the Republic. But his settlement relied on false fear and rigid political assumptions that crumbled soon after his resignation and death. The generation that followed Sulla inherited a republic already brittle. Its norms cracked its political class, divided into competing factions that no longer feared the consequences of pushing conflict beyond the boundaries of tradition. Rome remained powerful abroad, but internally, the Republic had lost the quiet restraints that once prevented its ambitious citizens from tearing it apart. Into this landscape stepped a trio of rising figures: Cneius Pompeius, Magnus, Marcus Licinius, Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar, each possessing extraordinary drive, each seeking glory, each willing to bend Rome's fragile framework in pursuit of personal destiny. Their rivalries and alliances, shifting like tectonic plates beneath the Senate's marble floors, would transform Rome irreversibly. Pompey rose first. A young and charismatic commander, he had fought under Sulla and quickly distinguished himself during the civil wars. Despite his youth and lack of formal experience, he earned triumphs for victories in Africa and Spain, where he crushed the remnants of Marius's supporters. His confidence bordering on audacity impressed some and unnerved others. Yet it was his role in ending the slave uprising led by Spartacus in 71 BCE that propelled his fame to unprecedented heights. Though Crassus defeated the main rebel force, Pompey claimed credit for destroying fleeing survivors, a political maneuver that deepened animosity between the two men and positioned Pompey as Rome's most celebrated general. Pompey's popularity allowed him to win the consulship alongside Crassus in 70 BCE, even though he had never held lower offices. Their tenure restored powers to the tribunes that Sulla had stripped away and rebalanced political life in ways that pleased many Roman citizens. Pompey's next major commission came in 67 BCE, when the Mediterranean was plagued by piracy, so disruptive that grain prices in Rome skyrocketed. The Senate hesitated to give extraordinary powers to any one man. But the popular assembly intervened, granting Pompey sweeping authority across the entire Mediterranean and its coastal regions. He executed the campaign with astonishing efficiency, clearing pirates from the sea in just a few months. This achievement solidified his reputation as Rome's indispensable champion and set the stage for even greater accomplishments. He soon received command against Mithridates VI of Pontus, Rome's persistent foe in the east. Over several years, Pompey dismantled Mithridates' power, reorganized eastern territories, created new provinces, and negotiated client kingdoms. The settlement he crafted fundamentally shaped Rome's eastern frontier for generations. When he returned to Italy, he expected gratitude in the form of land grants for his veterans and ratification of his eastern arrangements. But the Senate, wary of empowering him, further stalled. Pompey, frustrated, but strategic, sought new political allies. This is where Caesar entered the picture. Julius Caesar, though less accomplished militarily at the time, possessed a combination of charm, daring intellect, and political instinct unmatched in Roman politics. Born into an old patrician family, but not a wealthy one, he rose through the political ranks with calculated generosity, public displays, and persuasive oratory. His early career included priesthoods, military service, and an acclaimed tenure as governor of Hispania Ulterior, where he paid off debts, won victories, and earned a triumph he ultimately forfeited to pursue the consulship. Caesar understood that power in Rome required coalition, and the Senate's refusal to support Pompey created an opportunity. In 60 BC, Caesar orchestrated an unprecedented political alliance with Pompey and Crassus. Later, historians called it the First Triumvirate, an informal pact rather than a legal office, but powerful enough to control elections, pass legislation, and dominate policy. Caesar secured the consulship for 59 BCE, using his authority to pass land reforms, benefiting Pompey's veterans, and policies that pleased Crassus's financial interests. After his term, Caesar received a long provincial command in Gaul, a posting that would change both his fate and Rome's. Gaul, a vast region of Celtic tribes, offered opportunity and danger. Caesar presented his campaigns as defensive, protecting Roman allies from hostile tribes. But his ambitions soon expanded. Over nearly a decade, he waged war across Gaul, winning battles through speed discipline, engineering genius, and sheer audacity. His commentaries describe these campaigns with clarity and self-justification, shaping his public image as a heroic general and protector of the Republic. One of his most famous feats was bridging the Rhine in 10 days, a psychological blow demonstrating Rome's reach, and briefly crossing into Germania. He also invaded Britain, twice creating fascination back home, even though the expeditions brought little territorial gain. The human cost of Caesar's campaigns was enormous. Ancient sources claim that 1 million Gauls were killed and another million enslaved, though the figures are debated. Regardless of exact numbers, the wars transformed Caesar into one of the richest and most powerful figures in Roman history. He personally rewarded his legions, who grew fiercely loyal. His rising influence worried both Pompey and the Senate, especially as Crassus's death in 53 BCE, after a failed campaign against the Parthians, left the triumvirate unbalanced. Pompey drifted closer to the Senate, while Caesar's political enemies worked to strip him of power once his command ended. A turning point came when the Senate, influenced by Pompey's allies, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew that doing so would leave him vulnerable to prosecution, political destruction, and possibly assassination. He had enemies who viewed his removal as essential to restoring the Republic's balance. Caesar faced a choice: step down and trust hostile institutions, or cross a line no Roman commander should ever cross. In 49 BCE, he chose the latter. Caesar marched the 13th Legion south and crossed the Rubicon River, the northern boundary of Italy, knowing it meant civil war. According to later tradition, he uttered, "Alea iacta, est the die is cast," though whether he said it is uncertain. The symbolism, however, is clear. Caesar's march forced Rome into a monumental confrontation. Pompey, unprepared to fight in Italy, withdrew to the east to gather forces. Caesar swiftly secured the peninsula, then pursued Pompey across Greece. The decisive battle came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar outmaneuvered Pompey's larger army. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by officials hoping to win Caesar's favor. The event horrified Caesar, who reportedly wept at the sight of Pompey's severed head recognizing both the tragedy and the political symbolism. Yet the war was not over. Caesar fought campaigns in Egypt, the Middle East, and North Africa to defeat remaining opponents. His relationship with Cleopatra VII, formed during his time in Alexandria, further complicated Roman politics. Cleopatra sought stability for her kingdom. Caesar saw strategic advantage. Their alliance produced a son Caesarion, though his political future remained uncertain. By 46 to 44 BCE, Caesar had returned to Rome, triumphant, holding positions of unprecedented power, dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life. He enacted sweeping reforms, reorganizing debts, expanding the Senate, revising the calendar, granting citizenship in the provinces, and planning vast construction projects. Yet these actions, while stabilizing in many ways, alarmed senators who feared he sought monarchy. The question that continues to fascinate historians is whether Caesar intended to become a king in all but name, or whether he sought to rebuild the republic with stronger executive authority. His behavior was ambiguous enough to inspire suspicion, admiration, and fear. The tension reached a deadly climax on the Ides of March 44th BCE, when a group of senators claiming to defend liberty stabbed Caesar in the Senate House. His assassination shocked Rome, but instead of restoring the republic, it plunged the city into another cycle of chaos. Caesar's death created a power vacuum, and the men poised to fill it. Mark Antony and a young, largely underestimated heir named Gaius Octavius would soon reshape the world. Caesar's assassination did not restore the old republic. Instead, it created a vacuum that amplified every rivalry, every ambition, and every unresolved grievance simmering within Rome. The conspirators who struck him down, Brutus Cassius and their circle, believed the people would celebrate the liberation of the state. But Rome did not erupt in gratitude. It froze in uncertainty. Caesar had been immensely popular among soldiers and ordinary Romans, and his reforms, debt adjustments, citizenship grants, land settlements had reshaped lives across Italy. Crowds gathered in confusion rather than triumph. The Senate hesitated, afraid to praise the killing, yet equally afraid to condemn it. And into this atmosphere of tension walked two men who would define the next phase of the struggle: Mark Antony and Caesar's 18-year-old adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, soon to be known as Octavian. Mark Antony had served as Caesar's trusted lieutenant during the civil wars, known for his fiery oratory, charismatic bravado, and deep connection to the legions. He had flaws: impulsiveness, extravagance, and political overconfidence, but he possessed experience and authority that made him a natural contender for leadership. As Caesar's co-consul at the time of the assassination, Antony initially struck a cautious balance, offering amnesty to the conspirators, while ensuring Caesar's laws and appointments remained intact. This strategy aimed to preserve stability while quietly asserting his own dominance. But a pivotal moment soon tilted public opinion dramatically. At Caesar's funeral, Antony delivered an emotional, masterfully manipulative speech that inflamed the crowd, turning them against the assassins who fled Rome in fear. Antony had seized the narrative, casting Caesar as a martyr and himself as the defender of his legacy. Yet Antony underestimated the quiet determination of Octavian. The young heir traveled rapidly to Italy upon hearing of Caesar's death, guided by both personal ambition and the legal authority granted by adoption. Though only a teenager and lacking military experience, He demonstrated shrewd political instincts. Octavian paid Caesar's bequests to the Roman people, something Antony had delayed, earning immediate goodwill. He recruited veterans loyal to Caesar's memory, challenging Antony's claim to leadership. And he positioned himself as the legitimate inheritor of Caesar's legacy, even when others dismissed him as a boy playing at politics. Clashes emerged quickly. Antony sought to secure Cisalpine Gaul as his power base, besieging Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins, in Mutina. The Senate, eager to check Antony's growing power, formed an unlikely alliance with Octavian. They granted him imperium legal military authority, despite his youth, a decision that would haunt them. Two consuls, Aulus Hirtius and Gaius Pansa, marched north with Octavian to relieve the siege. The battles around Mutina in 43 BCE were bloody, and though Antony was defeated, both consuls died. Octavian suddenly found himself leading their armies, commanding immense loyalty, and holding a position the Senate had never intended for him. Refusing to be sidelined, Octavian marched his forces to Rome and demanded the consulship, leveraging the Senate's fear and the soldiers' devotion. Once in power, he moved to reconcile publicly with Antony, while preparing privately to dominate him. Soon, Octavian Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the last major Caesarian general with significant forces, formed a formal power-sharing alliance called the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the informal First Triumvirate, this arrangement was legally recognized and granted sweeping authority to rewrite laws, appoint officials, and restore order. But peace came at a terrible cost. To secure their regime, the triumvirs launched proscriptions reminiscent of Sulla's terror lists of political opponents condemned to death, their property confiscated. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and outspoken critic of Antony, fell victim to this purge. His execution symbolizing the end of the Republic's last major voice of resistance. With domestic enemies eliminated, the triumvirs turned to the conspirators who had fled east. Brutus and Cassius had built a powerful force across Greece and Asia Minor, hoping to restore the Republic through military victory. At Philippi in 42 BC, the triumvirs confronted them in two massive battles. Antony distinguished himself as the superior battlefield commander, while Octavian struggled with illness and inexperience. Ultimately, the conspirators were defeated. Both Brutus and Cassius died by suicide. Their deaths extinguished the last major senatorial attempt to restore the old order. Rome's destiny would now be settled not by republican ideals, but by the ambitions of its surviving power brokers. After Philippi, the triumvirate divided the empire among themselves. Lepidus took Africa, Antony took the east, and Octavian took the west. But this division only delayed the inevitable. Antony embarked on a grand eastern project, partnering with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, whose intelligence, political skill, and experience in surviving dynastic turmoil made her a formidable ally. Their relationship, both political and romantic, produced twins and reshaped Antony's ambitions. He sought to build a vast eastern power base, blending Roman military strength with Egypt's wealth. He held lavish ceremonies in Alexandria, distributing titles and territories to Cleopatra and their children. Many in Rome interpreted these gestures as signs of disloyalty, imagining Antony drifting from Roman identity into the orbit of an Eastern monarchy. Octavian capitalized on this perception brilliantly. He launched a propaganda campaign portraying Antony as a man corrupted by foreign luxury, seduced by Cleopatra, and plotting to undermine Rome. Octavian contrasted Antony's alleged decadence with his own cultivated image of discipline, piety, and duty to Rome. To strengthen this public persona, he married Livia Drusilla, aligning himself with an aristocratic family and projecting the stability of domestic Roman virtue. His political framing was calculated, effective, and merciless. The triumvirate eventually dissolved. Lepidus attempted to assert control in Sicily, but failed, and Octavian stripped him of power, reducing him to a political nonentity. The stage was set for the final confrontation between Octavian and Antony, a struggle as ideological as it was military. Octavian moved the Senate to declare war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, a maneuver that framed the conflict as a defense of Rome against foreign domination. This rhetoric rallied support and painted Antony as a traitor, aligned with an Egyptian queen. In 31 BCE, their forces clashed at the naval battle of Actium, where the fleet of Octavian's general Agrippa trapped Antony and Cleopatra. Their escape to Egypt marked the effective end of their resistance. The aftermath was swift and tragic. As Octavian closed in on Alexandria, Antony fell on his sword, dying in Cleopatra's arms. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded in Octavian's triumph, took her own life, likely by poison, rather than a dramatic serpent bite, though myths endure. Octavian had their son Caesarion killed, but spared other children. Egypt, immensely wealthy and long independent, became a Roman province. The victory eliminated every rival and left Octavian unchallenged. By 27 BC, Octavian received the honorific title Augustus, marking the beginning of the Roman Empire. He carefully preserved the outward forms of the Republic, while holding supreme authority, military command control over provinces, nomination of magistrates, and influence over legislation. His power rested not on official titles alone, but on subtle arrangement and public trust. Augustus framed his rule as a restoration, a return to peace after decades of civil war. His reforms stabilized the state, reorganized the army, improved provincial governance, and initiated an era remembered as the Pax Romana, an extended period of relative peace, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. Augustus's careful consolidation of power laid the foundations for an empire that would stretch across continents, an empire that would come to define the ancient world in both triumph and contradiction. With the civil wars ended, he presented himself not as a king Rome despised monarchy, but as princeps, the first citizen, a modest title that masked immense authority. He held tribunician power for life, controlled the provinces where legions were stationed, and shaped senatorial decisions through influence rather than overt domination. Yet this subtlety reassured Romans. After decades of bloodshed, they craved stability more than ideological purity. Augustus gave them order, prosperity, and the soothing illusion that the Republic still existed in some form. The era known as the Pax Romana began under his rule, stretching roughly 2 centuries. Rome's frontiers expanded into Egypt, the Alps, Central Europe, and much of the Balkans. Legions became permanent professional forces with standardized training equipment and terms of service. Augustus reduced the number of legions after the civil wars, but stationed them strategically along borders the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, where they served both defensive and psychological roles. The empire's interior grew increasingly safe for travel and trade. Merchants carried spices from Arabia, silk from China, glass from Rome, and grain from North Africa, along routes that curved across mountains, deserts, and seas. Augustus reorganized provincial administration, cracked down on corruption, reformed taxation, and supported public building programs that beautified the capital and improved daily life. Rome itself gleamed under Augustus's patronage. He famously boasted that he had found a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Temples were restored, aqueducts repaired, forums paved, and new monuments raised to honor Rome's achievements. The Ara Pacis, an altar dedicated to peace, blended religious reverence with imperial symbolism. Poets flourished under Augustan patronage, especially Virgil, whose Aeneid connected Rome's origins to Trojan legend and framed Augustus's rule as the fulfillment of divine destiny. Literature, architecture, and sculpture flourished, blending Roman practicality with Greek artistry. Yet even within this cultural bloom, anxieties lingered. Some Romans worried that too much Greek influence softened old values. Others feared that the Republic's spirit had been permanently replaced with imperial spectacle. Augustus balanced these tensions carefully, imposing moral legislation while encouraging creative expression. Not all went smoothly. The most devastating military disaster of Augustus's reign occurred in 9 CE, when 3 Roman legions, under Publius Quinctilius Varus, were massacred in the Teutoburg forest. Arminius, a Germanic noble, educated and trained by Rome, betrayed Roman trust and orchestrated an ambush in dense, rain-soaked woodlands. The legions, caught in narrow paths, were slaughtered almost to the last man. The psychological impact far exceeded the territorial loss. Augustus reportedly wandered his palace crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." The defeat halted Roman expansion into Germania, leaving the Rhine as the frontier for centuries. Historians still debate whether Augustus or Varus bears more responsibility. Was it strategic overreach or administrative complacency? The event remains one of the most studied turning points in Roman military history. After Augustus's death in 14 CE, the imperial system he crafted passed to his stepson Tiberius. Though competent and experienced, Tiberius was less charismatic, more reclusive, and often mistrusted by the Senate. His rule saw the rise of the Praetorian Guard as a decisive political force. Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect, amassed immense influence before being exposed and executed for treason. Tiberius eventually withdrew to Capri, leaving Rome governed by letters, rumors, and the unpredictable decisions of imperial administrators. Despite this atmosphere, the empire remained stable. Its machinery continued functioning even when leadership faltered. Caligula followed a young emperor whose early promise rapidly deteriorated into erratic behavior. Ancient sources describe extravagance, paranoia, and cruelty, though some accounts may be exaggerated by hostile senators. His reign ended violently when the Praetorian Guard assassinated him. In the chaos that followed, the Guard proclaimed Claudius emperor. Claudius, often underestimated due to physical impairments and scholarly temperament, proved an effective administrator. He expanded citizenship, organized bureaucracy, and conquered Britain in 43 CE, a campaign long considered difficult and uncertain. Yet his reign also reflected the darker side of palace politics, with court freedmen and his wife, Messalina, influencing decisions and conspiracies simmering constantly. Nero succeeded Claudius, becoming one of Rome's most infamous rulers. His early years, guided by Seneca and Burrus, were stable and relatively moderate. But as he matured, Nero embraced theatricality, artistic performances, and lavish spending. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated, and accusations of tyranny mounted. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE devastated much of the city. Although Nero rebuilt Rome with broader streets and new architectural regulations, rumors spread that he had started the fire. He blamed Christians, a small misunderstood sect, initiating brutal persecutions. Eventually, revolts in Gaul, Hispania, and Judea eroded his support. Declared a public enemy by the Senate, Nero fled and took his own life. In 68 C, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty. What followed was chaos, the year of the four emperors. 69 C, Galba Otho Vitellius, and finally, Vespasian battled for control. Legions declared loyalty to their own generals, revealing how fragmented the empire could become without a clear succession system. Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty, ultimately restored order. A practical, disciplined ruler, he directed resources toward reconstruction, fiscal repair, and public works, most famously beginning construction on the Flavian Amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum. His sons Titus and Domitian continued the dynasty. Titus earned admiration for his handling of disasters, the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, and a massive fire in Rome, while Domitian ruled autocratically, promoting efficiency but alienating the Senate. He was assassinated in 96 CE, ending the Flavian line. Yet the empire endured because its structures had grown resilient. By the time the Nerva Antonini dynasty began with Nerva in 96 CE, Rome had accumulated enough administrative experience, military discipline, and cultural cohesion to maintain stability even when rulers faltered. Nerva adopted Trajan, beginning a pattern of choosing successors based on merit rather than lineage, a decision many historians regard as a significant factor in the stability of the 2nd century. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia and pushing into Arabia and Mesopotamia. His reign represented confidence, prosperity, and expansion, the full bloom of the Pax Romana. Under Hadrian, Rome shifted from conquest to consolidation. He strengthened borders, built the famous wall in northern Britain, toured the provinces extensively, and invested in local infrastructure. His architectural legacy included the Pantheon, a masterpiece of engineering and elegance, whose dome still stands unmatched in ancient architecture. Antoninus Pius followed with an extraordinarily peaceful reign, marked by legal reforms and careful governance. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, brought wisdom and restraint, but faced renewed dangers from Germanic tribes and a devastating plague, likely smallpox, that swept through the empire. The Pax Romana, though luminous and far-reaching, was never immune to fracture. Beneath its surface lay anxieties that drifted upward whenever leadership faltered, whenever famine or revolt or succession uncertainty rippled across the empire. And with the passing of the adoptive emperors, Rome entered a new era, shaped by a dynasty whose stories blended grandeur with scandal, stability with crisis, and historical clarity, with lingering mysteries that scholars still debate. The Julio-Claudian line had already demonstrated how family politics, rumor, and imperial privilege could tilt the empire into extremes. Now the imperial office would again test how much turbulence Rome's system could withstand. Commodus's accession in 180 CE marked an abrupt shift from the disciplined philosophy of Marcus Aurelius to a reign defined by extravagance, insecurity, and theatrical display. As the biological son of Marcus, he broke the long tradition of able adopted heirs. Commodus's rule began with promise. He made peace with some Germanic tribes, seeming to prefer stability over long campaigns. But his disinterest in administration quickly became clear. He indulged in lavish games, participated personally in the arena, and surrounded himself with sycophants who exploited his vanity. Ancient writers portray him as cruel, erratic, and obsessed with portraying himself as a Hercules-like figure. But the truth is complicated. Some of the darkest anecdotes may reflect senatorial bias. Others reflect genuine administrative neglect. What remains certain is that Commodus's detachment from governance destabilized the empire's political circuitry. Court conspiracies multiplied. The Praetorian Guard gained influence. Confidence in the emperor weakened. In 192 CE, he was assassinated in a plot involving his mistress senators and palace insiders, an ignominious end that hurled Rome into chaos. The following year became known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Pertinax, a respected senator, attempted to restore order, but lasted only a few months before being murdered by the Praetorian Guard. In an unprecedented act, the Guard auctioned the imperial throne to Didius Julianus, whose willingness to pay an enormous bribe outraged the legions stationed across the empire. Three generals, Septimius Severus, Pescennius, Niger, and Clodius Albinus, vied for power. Severus moved swiftly, securing Rome, neutralizing rivals, and founding the Severan dynasty. His reign strengthened the military-elevated soldiers' status and expanded legal rights for provincial communities. His sons Caracalla and Geta inherited an increasingly militarized empire. Caracalla is remembered for the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212 CE, a decree extending Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. Historians continue to debate his motives. Was it a genuine gesture toward unity? A means to broaden the tax base? A symbolic assertion of imperial authority? Whatever the reason, the edict transformed Roman identity, dissolving all distinctions between Romans and provincials. Caracalla's architectural legacy included the massive baths of Caracalla, a monumental complex whose scale reflected imperial prosperity. Yet his reign was also marked by fratricide. He murdered his brother Geta, and by increasingly authoritarian tendencies. Like many emperors who relied heavily on the army, he spent much of his reign traveling with legions, strengthening frontier positions, and projecting imperial power. His assassination in 217 CE opened the gates to another cycle of political uncertainty. Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect, who replaced him, lacked senatorial support and military legitimacy. Rebel forces eventually elevated Elagabalus, a young Syrian priest with strong backing from the Eastern legions. His brief reign from 218 to 222 CE remains one of the most unusual in Roman history. Elagabalus attempted to impose the worship of his eastern sun god, Elagabal, at the heart of Roman religion, even bringing sacred stones and ritual practices to the capital. His behavior, religious experimentation, unusual marriage arrangements, flamboyant ceremonies, puzzled contemporaries and later historians. The Senate viewed him as a threat to Roman tradition. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard murdered him and installed Severus Alexander, another young ruler. Alexander Severus attempted reform and moderation, guided by his mother Julia Mamaea and a circle of advisors. But external pressures intensified during his reign. Along the eastern frontier, a newly energized Persian power, the Sassanid Empire, replaced the Parthians and adopted a far more aggressive posture. In the north, Germanic confederations tested the Rhine frontier. When Alexander attempted to appease some northern tribes through negotiation, his troops mutinied, killing him and ending the Severan dynasty in 235 CE. This moment marked the beginning of the 3rd century crisis, a period of fragmentation, invasions, economic strain, and rapid imperial turnover. Though this crisis belongs more fully to later sections, its roots can be traced to the leadership volatility that followed Commodus and the increasingly decisive role played by the military. Emperors rose and fell with frightening speed, chosen not by the Senate, but by whichever army held the strongest frontier position. Yet even as the empire fractured, its capacity to survive reflected remarkable resilience, an underlying strength that remained despite political chaos. But before the crisis fully broke, another dramatic and enduring episode emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean: the Jewish-Roman conflicts, culminating in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. These conflicts, rooted in cultural tension, taxation disputes, and local governance issues, flared during the reigns of the Flavians. Vespasian began the suppression. His son Titus completed it. The siege of Jerusalem, intense and violent, ended with the temple's destruction, an event embedded deeply in global religious memory. Though details vary among accounts, the war highlights the complexities of managing a pluralistic empire, where imperial authority sometimes collided with deeply rooted local identities. Another enduring puzzle lies in Nero's Great Fire and his relationship with early Christians. Roman sources depict Christians as scapegoats, yet archaeological and textual evidence continues to prompt debate about how large the Christian population was, how the community operated, and how Nero's persecution influenced later Christian identity. Scholars analyze the political context. Nero needed a villain after the fire, and Christians, being unfamiliar and misunderstood, became convenient targets. It reminds us that many imperial decisions were shaped by immediate political needs rather than broader strategy. Even lighter aspects of Roman life during this period hold historical intrigue. The Colosseum's completion under Titus transformed public entertainment into a monumental political gesture. While gladiatorial games had existed for centuries, their scale now reflected imperial priorities: spectacle as social pacification, celebration, and propaganda. Debates continue over how often exotic animals were used, how convict labor constructed the arena, and how gladiators themselves navigated a world that blended fame, danger, and rigid training. Roman society consumed spectacle eagerly, a reminder that the empire's cultural life was as complex and multifaceted as its political one. The calm illusion of the Pax Romana began cracking in the mid-2nd century, and by 235 CE, the cracks widened into a chasm that historians now call the 3rd century crisis, a stretch of roughly 50 years when Rome nearly ceased to function as a unified state. The old assumptions that had stabilized the empire, predictable succession, reliable taxes, secure borders, and consistent military discipline, eroded all at once. What emerged was a whirlwind of plagues, invasions, mutinies, inflation, and breakaway regions, all colliding at a speed Rome had never experienced. And yet, even in this turbulence, the empire revealed an extraordinary ability to adapt, react, and survive through a combination of improvisation, local resilience, and sheer institutional inertia. The crisis roots stretched back decades. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, swept through the empire during Marcus Aurelius's reign, killing millions and weakening manpower, economic stability, and military recruitment. Then came the plague of Cyprian in the mid-3rd century, an epidemic so severe that some cities lost a majority of their inhabitants. Contemporary descriptions speak of fever, intestinal distress, ulcers, and exhaustion symptoms still debated today. The cumulative toll of these pandemics left fields, untilled armies, understrength and trade caravans increasingly vulnerable. Rome's demographic base, the foundation of its military and tax system, faltered. Meanwhile, external pressures intensified dramatically. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic coalitions, Alemanni Goths, Franks grew stronger, more organized, and more mobile. These groups were not single tribes, but shifting alliances responding to population pressures, climate fluctuations, and opportunities created by Rome's weakness. They raided deeper into imperial territory than ever before, threatening cities long considered safe. Along the eastern frontier, the Parthians had fallen, replaced by the Sassanid Empire, a centralized, aggressive Persian power whose ambition outmatched Rome's old eastern rival. Shapur, I the Sassanid king, launched repeated invasions into Mesopotamia and Syria, capturing cities, seizing treasure, and destabilizing frontier defenses. These external assaults collided with internal instability. The assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander in 235 CE by mutinous soldiers triggered a domino effect. Emperors rose and fell at a staggering pace, often elevated by the army, and then killed by the same soldiers for failing to deliver victory pay or prestige. In less than 50 years, Rome saw more than 20 emperors, many ruling only months. Some were capable, others barely had time to act, and a few were catastrophically incompetent. The army fractured into regional power bases, Danubian legions, Rhine legions, Eastern legions, each capable of creating their own emperor. During this period, Rome itself suffered humiliations unimaginable in earlier centuries. In 260 CE, Emperor Valerian marched east to confront Shapur the Fun, only to be captured in battle, the only Roman emperor to suffer that fate. Ancient accounts claim he lived out his days in captivity, used as a living footstool for the Persian king, or slowly flayed after years of humiliation. Whether these gruesome details are literal or exaggerated, Valerian's capture sent shockwaves across the empire. His son Gallienus ruled alone afterward, facing invasions from every side and rebel generals erupting like fires across imperial territory. At the same time, parts of the empire broke away entirely. In the west, the Gallic Empire emerged under Postumus, encompassing Gaul Britannia and briefly Hispania. Postumus was not a usurper driven by vanity. He was a pragmatic general trying to protect local populations, while central authority faltered. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra built a powerful semi-independent state stretching from Syria to Egypt. Zenobia's court blended Greek-Roman and Eastern influences, projecting refinement and ambition. She governed efficiently, expanded trade, and controlled crucial caravan routes. Many scholars still debate whether her goal was full independence or temporary autonomy amid Roman instability. Either way, her rise demonstrated how quickly regional powers could assert themselves when the center weakened. Economic turmoil magnified the crisis, with military expenses skyrocketing and tax revenues shrinking. Emperors debased the currency, repeatedly reducing silver content in coins until they were nearly worthless. Inflation spiraled. Barter replaced cash in some regions. Trade networks frayed as banditry increased. Rural communities fortified themselves, building walls around villas and small towns. Urban centers shrank or reorganized to survive. Yet even within this chaos, local officials often kept courts running. Tax collectors persisted, and cities adapted their budgets. The empire did not collapse uniformly. Instead, it endured through countless small acts of resilience. Despite the gloom, a series of surprisingly capable emperors emerged, men who clawed the empire back from fragmentation. Gallienus, long overshadowed by his father's fate, actually implemented crucial reforms. He barred senators from army commands, elevating career soldiers instead. He reorganized cavalry as a mobile strike force, and he supported talented generals who later became emperors. Unfortunately, he was assassinated by rivals just as stability neared. Then came Claudius II, Gothicus, who defeated a massive Gothic invasion at the Battle of Naissus. His victory bought Rome breathing room, though he died of plague soon after. Aurelian followed one of the most effective emperors in Roman history. His reign from 270 to 275 CE was short but transformative. He reunited the Gallic Empire, crushed Zenobia, and reincorporated Palmyra, strengthened frontier defenses, and began constructing the Aurelian walls around Rome itself. These walls, still standing today, symbolized both vulnerability and resilience. The empire could no longer rely solely on distant legions, but it still had the capacity to mobilize massive labor for defense. Aurelian also tackled economic instability, instituting monetary reforms and attempting to restore confidence in the currency. His dedication to state repair earned him the title Restitutor Orbis Restorer of the World. His assassination by conspirators cut his reforms short, yet the momentum he created carried forward. The crisis would not fully ease until the reigns of Diocletian and his successors. But Aurelian proved that Rome could still produce leaders capable of extraordinary recovery. Another mystery of this era lies in the religious transformations bubbling beneath the surface. Christianity expanded rapidly during the 3rd century, especially among urban populations and marginalized groups. The empire's instability may have accelerated conversions, offering spiritual comfort and communal support. While emperors mostly tolerated or inconsistently persecuted Christians during this period, the increasing visibility of the faith set the stage for future conflicts and imperial engagement with religious identity. When the storm of the 3rd century crisis finally showed signs of clearing, Rome stood, changed, scarred, but still alive, a battered giant in need of structural reinvention rather than temporary fixes. The empire had survived invasions, secessions, pandemics, and a parade of short-lived emperors. Yet it could no longer rely on the old republican bones that had been stretched thinner and thinner across a geography too vast and a population too diverse. Into this fragile landscape stepped Diocletian, a soldier emperor of Illyrian origin, whose rise marked the beginning of one of the most ambitious governmental overhauls in Roman history. His reforms were not minor adjustments. They were a redesign of how Rome understood power administration, economy, succession, and stability. Diocletian assumed the purple in 284 CE and immediately recognized that no single ruler could effectively command the entire empire. Communications were too slow, borders too long, crises too unpredictable. Earlier emperors had delegated limited authority to trusted generals. But Diocletian envisioned a system where power itself was formally shared. He created what we now call the tetrarchy rule of four, dividing the empire into two broad halves, each governed by an Augustus and a junior Caesar. Diocletian took the eastern position as senior Augustus, while Maximian governed the west. Galerius and Constantius Chlorus served as Caesar's boys to succeed their Augusti. The system aimed to solve Rome's recurring succession crises by creating orderly, predetermined transitions and ensuring that major regions always had a ruler present. The Tetrarchy also reshaped imperial ideology. Emperors no longer walked among the Senate as first among equals. Instead, they cultivated an aura of divine distance. Elaborate court ceremonies, jeweled robes, and increase in palace ritual. These changes signaled that the emperors were embodiments of imperial stability, rather than ordinary political leaders. The shift reflected both practical governance needs and the broader cultural transformation of the late empire. People expected their rulers to project authority capable of anchoring a world that had felt dangerously unstable for decades. Administrative reforms followed. Diocletian reorganized provinces, creating smaller, more manageable units grouped into larger dioceses overseen by vicars. This layering increased oversight, reduced the power of any single governor to rebel, and strengthened imperial control. He also attempted to separate civil and military authority, assigning provincial governance to civilian officials while giving military commanders focused tactical responsibilities. Though imperfect in practice, the separation aimed to prevent generals from accumulating too much political power, a recurring problem during the 3rd century. Economic troubles, however, proved harder to tame. Inflation had ravaged the currency for decades, and Diocletian attempted to stabilize it through monetary reform and tax restructuring. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE, an enormous document setting price ceilings for goods and wages across the empire. The intention was noble: stop profiteering and curb inflation, but enforcement proved nearly impossible. Local markets often ignored the edict, violations multiplied, and in many areas, trade simply retreated into informal networks. Still, the effort reflects how deeply Diocletian understood the need to restore economic confidence. His tax reforms, especially the capitatio iugatio system, created more predictable assessment methods by tying taxes to land labor capacity and population. These reforms endured long after the price edict faded into irrelevance. Military strategy evolved as well. Legions increasingly operated as smaller, more mobile units, more suited to repel raids and respond to frontier threats. Heavy fortifications rose along borders, especially along the Danube and the eastern frontier. The empire shifted from aggressive expansion to defensive consolidation, a theme that dominated late Roman strategy. Diocletian also addressed religious matters, initially tolerating a range of cults, but later launching a fierce persecution of Christians, partly due to concerns about unity within the imperial cult and the symbolic role Christianity played in resisting participation in state rituals. His persecution, though intense, ultimately failed to extinguish the growing movement. When Diocletian and Maximian abdicated in 305 CE, one of the rare voluntary retirements in imperial history, the tetrarchic system immediately revealed its weaknesses. Successions did not unfold smoothly. Personal ambitions, rivalries, and loyalties to specific generals quickly disrupted the careful hierarchical structure. Constantius Chlorus died in Britain the following year, and his troops proclaimed his son Constantine as Augustus. This violated Diocletian's intended succession order and triggered a cascade of competing claims. Maxentius in Rome, Licinius in the Balkans, and several other figures entered the fray, ensuring that another civil war would determine the empire's next chapter. Constantine's rise unfolded through a mixture of military victories, political calculation, and an ability to adapt to the changing spiritual and administrative landscape. His most famous moment came in 312 CE at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge against Maxentius. Ancient accounts describe Constantine seeing a sign in the sky, often interpreted as a Christian symbol, accompanied by the message, "In this sign conquer." Whether the event unfolded exactly as later chroniclers describe remains debated, but the consequences are unmistakable. Constantine's victory positioned him as the most powerful emperor in the West, and his evolving relationship with Christianity reshaped the entire religious architecture of the empire. In 313 CE, Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious toleration to Christians and marking a decisive shift from persecution to imperial support. Christianity's status changed from a marginal, sometimes persecuted religion to a legally recognized faith with imperial backing. This transformation did not instantly make Rome a Christian empire, but it accelerated a process already underway, drawing new converts, increasing institutional structure, and elevating bishops into influential roles. Meanwhile, Constantine continued consolidating power. His conflicts with Licinius eventually culminated in a final war. Licinius was defeated in 324 CE, leaving Constantine the sole ruler of a reunified empire. Constantine's most enduring administrative decision was the founding of a new capital. Recognizing the strategic advantages of the East, he selected Byzantium and transformed it into Constantinople, inaugurated in 330 CE. Positioned between Europe and Asia, close to the Danube frontier near vital trade routes, and easier to defend than Old Rome, the city symbolized an empire shifting eastward in political, economic, and cultural weight. Constantinople became a hub of administration learning and architecture, crowned by new forums, churches, and palaces. It embodied the late empire's direction increasingly. Greek-speaking, increasingly Christian, and increasingly centered on the Eastern Mediterranean. Constantine also restructured the army, further refining distinctions between frontier troops, limitanae, and mobile field units, comitatenses, an arrangement designed to help the empire respond to crises with greater agility. His reign strengthened bureaucracy, refined legal codes, and stabilized currency in ways that built upon Diocletian's earlier reforms rather than rejecting them. Constantine's Christianity-infused rhetoric, imperial imagery, and patronage networks increasingly shaped imperial politics, though the exact nature of his personal beliefs remains debated among scholars. Was he driven by genuine spiritual conviction, political pragmatism, or a blend of both evidence points in all directions, leaving room for interpretation? Constantine's death left behind an empire both stabilized and transformed, yet still vulnerable to the pressures that had built across the previous century. His reforms had created a stronger administrative skeleton, but the empire remained vast, diverse, and dependent on continual military vigilance. The delicate balance he forged between imperial authority and bureaucratic infrastructure required capable successors to maintain it. Instead, the decades following his reign produced a series of contested successions, shifting alliances, religious debates, and escalating pressures along frontier zones, where new forces emerged with growing confidence. Through this landscape, one figure eventually shaped the imperial order more deeply than any ruler since Constantine Theodosius I. And in his wake, both the Western Roman Empire's decline and the Eastern Empire's long survival began taking their distinct paths. After Constantine's sons inherited the empire in 337 CE, factional rivalry tore through the ruling family. Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II divided the territories, but soon clashed over influence and legitimacy. Constantine II died in an ill-fated attempt to invade his brother's territory, leaving Constans and Constantius II as co-rulers. Constans governed the West until he was overthrown and killed by the usurper Magnentius. Constantius II then waged a long, exhausting civil war to regain the West. Although victorious, he faced external pressures from Sassanid Persia and mounting tensions along the Danube. The empire under Constantius II navigated crises with caution, religious disputes with intensity, and military threats with strategic restraint. Yet he struggled to unify the empire's diverse regions under coherent leadership, especially as Christian theological debates, particularly Arianism versus Nicene orthodoxy, split communities and imperial politics alike. Amid these struggles, one figure rose unexpectedly. Julian, later called the apostate Constantine's nephew. Initially installed as Caesar to stabilize Gaul, Julian demonstrated impressive military skill, defeating Frankish and Alemannic groups and restoring frontier defense. His popularity with troops and success in the West elevated him rapidly. When Constantius II died in 361 CE, Julian became sole emperor. His reign, though short, remains one of the most intriguing in late Roman history. Julian rejected the Christianity promoted by Constantine and sought to revive traditional Roman paganism. His reforms were not merely religious. He aimed to reduce the influence of the imperial court, promote philosophical rigor, and restore a sense of civic virtue he believed Christianity had weakened. But Julian's ambitious vision ended abruptly in 363 CE, when he died during a Persian campaign, stabbed in battle under circumstances still debated. His death created a succession vacuum filled by Jovian, who signed a disadvantageous peace with Persia to withdraw Roman forces safely. Soon after, Valentinian I, a tough and pragmatic general, became emperor in the West, while his brother Valens ruled the East. Their joint reign reflects the increasingly distinct paths of the empire's halves. The West struggled with frequent raids along the Rhine, while the East confronted the growing power of Gothic confederations, seeking settlement and security within Roman borders. Valens's reign culminated in one of Rome's most consequential military catastrophes, the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. Pressured by Gothic refugees fleeing the Huns, Rome admitted them into the empire as federates, semi-autonomous groups obligated to provide military service. But corruption and mismanagement by Roman officials pushed the Goths to revolt. Valens, eager to claim victory alone without waiting for Western reinforcements, attacked prematurely. The battle turned disastrous as Gothic cavalry flanked Roman lines, trapping and annihilating much of the Eastern field army. Valens himself perished, his body never found. Adrianople shocked contemporaries. Some writers compared it to Kane, a brutal reminder of how devastating overconfidence and miscommunication could be. Into the crisis stepped Theodosius Stump, appointed by the new emperor Gratian to salvage the East. Theodosius inherited an army shattered by defeat, frontiers breached by migrating tribes, and provinces anxious about uncertain loyalties. Instead of attempting to annihilate the Goths, Theodosius pursued negotiated settlement. He allowed them to remain within imperial territory under their own leaders as federates bound to serve Rome, but governed internally by their own customs. Historians still debate the long-term consequences of this decision. Some view it as a pragmatic necessity, given the weakened state of the Eastern Army. Others argue it set a precedent that undermined Roman control, allowing autonomous barbarian groups to become powerful military actors within the empire. Yet Theodosius's influence extended far beyond military policy. He played a decisive role in defining Christianity's place within imperial identity. In 380 CE, the Edict of Thessalonica declared Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire. Pagan rituals lost state support, temples were gradually closed or repurposed, and theological disputes increasingly shaped political alliances. Bishops, especially Ambrose of Milan, gained influence, occasionally challenging imperial decisions. When Theodosius ordered a harsh reprisal after a riot in Thessalonica, Ambrose forced him to perform public penance, a demonstration of the growing moral authority of the Christian Church over imperial actions. Theodosius's reign thus accelerated a cultural transformation already underway. Rome was becoming not just administratively different, but spiritually distinct from its ancient roots. Theodosius also reunited the empire temporarily after crushing the usurper Eugenius in 394 CE. But his death the following year split the empire permanently between his two young sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. Their reigns exposed the widening gap between the two halves. The East, centered on Constantinople, maintained stronger financial systems, more defensible borders, and more stable administrative structures. The West faced declining tax revenues, depopulation in some regions, and growing pressure from migrating and invading groups who sought land safety or plunder. Into this Western vulnerability marched Alaric, a Gothic leader once allied with Rome. Frustrated by unmet promises of payment and recognition, he led his forces into Italy repeatedly. Honorius, ruling from the safety of Ravenna, relied heavily on generals like Stilicho to manage the crisis. Stilicho's political enemies, however, undermined him, and his execution in 408 CE left the West defenseless. In 410 CE, Alaric sacked Rome, the first time in nearly 800 years that a foreign army breached the city. Although the physical destruction was limited compared to later depredations, the psychological impact was seismic. The eternal city symbol of Rome's glory had fallen. Pagan writers blamed Christianity, arguing the abandonment of traditional gods had angered divine powers. Christian thinkers like Augustine responded with works such as The City of God, reframing the fall as a turning point in a cosmic narrative rather than the collapse of divine favor. Rome's sack exposed a deeper truth. The Western Empire no longer possessed the unified military muscle needed to repel such incursions. Meanwhile, the East held firm, continuing to strengthen fortifications, refine administration, and integrate Christian doctrine into statecraft. Constantinople, with its strategic geography, robust economy, and increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy became the stabilizing anchor of the empire. Its survival contrasted starkly with the West's unraveling, revealing how differently the two halves had adapted to the pressures of the late Roman world. The Western Empire entered the 5th century, already weakened by decades of political fragility, economic contraction, and reliance on federate armies, whose loyalty could shift unpredictably. The sack of Rome in 410 CE did not destroy the empire outright. Administration, continued, cities functioned, and life went on. But it signaled a profound loss of psychological invincibility. Rome, once the center of an unstoppable force, now looked vulnerable, no longer shielded by the vast military machinery that had defended it for centuries. The true unraveling would unfold gradually through a series of crises that eroded Western authority piece by piece, rather than through a single catastrophic collapse. Honorius, the Western Emperor, during the 410 sack, ruled mostly from Ravenna, a city surrounded by marshes and safer from invasion. The choice of Ravenna as residence symbolized the West's retreat from Rome itself, a geographic and symbolic shift. Honorius relied heavily on generals because he lacked both aptitude and interest in governance. The most talented of these generals, Stilicho, had previously held the western frontier together, balancing diplomacy with military action and using federate troops effectively. But court intrigue, jealousy, and anti-barbarian sentiment led to his execution in 408 CE. This decision removed the one figure who had kept the West's defensive system intact. Afterwards, Roman leadership fractured further, with successive generals unable to maintain unity among armies increasingly composed of Gothic Alan Vandal and Hunnic units. The migration of peoples across the empire's borders intensified. These movements were not always straightforward invasions. They were often groups fleeing pressure from other migrating or conquering peoples, particularly the Huns, whose rise remains one of the most dramatic developments of the period. Under their enigmatic leader, Attila, the Huns built an empire spanning Central and Eastern Europe, uniting diverse nomadic groups through a mixture of charisma, terror, diplomacy, and strategic extraction of tribute. Their presence destabilized regions that had long supplied Rome with both soldiers and taxes. Gothic groups fleeing the Huns crossed the Danube, seeking refuge inside the empire. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the Rhine in 406 during a severe winter that froze the river entering Gaul in large numbers. The Roman state lacked the forces to repel or contain these migrations, forcing it into uneasy treaties that gave land in exchange for military service. As these federate groups settled within imperial borders, the distinction between Roman territory and barbarian territory became blurred. Some regions functioned semi-independently, even while claiming theoretical allegiance to Ravenna. The Visigoths, after sacking Rome, were granted lands in Gaul, where they formed what would become the Visigothic kingdom, centered around Toulouse. Roman administrators continued to operate, taxes continued to flow, and a hybrid world emerged where Roman law coexisted with Gothic leadership. This blending reflects one of the era's most debated aspects. Was the Western Empire collapsing or transforming into a new, culturally mixed order? The Vandal kingdom's rise in North Africa added another blow to Western stability. In 429 CE, the Vandals under King Gaiseric crossed into Africa, moving rapidly through regions that had been Rome's breadbasket for centuries. North Africa was essential to the Western economy, its grain-fed urban populations, and funded armies. When the Vandals captured Carthage in 439 CE, they gained control of the Mediterranean's most vital shipping routes. Their fleet became powerful enough to raid coastal cities, including Rome itself, in 455, when Geiseric's forces conducted a plundering that, while not as destructive as later myth implied, further humiliated the empire. The loss of Africa irrevocably crippled Western finances, leaving the government dependent on shrinking revenues and increasingly unable to pay or provision soldiers. Amid these pressures, the Western Empire saw a rapid turnover of emperors, many manipulated by powerful generals. One of the most capable of these generals was Aetius, often called the last of the Romans. Aetius understood the shifting dynamics of the age better than most. He grew up as a hostage among the Huns and maintained diplomatic relations with them, using alliances and negotiation to manage Rome's weakening frontiers. His most famous achievement came in 451 CE at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where he, alongside his Visigothic allies, confronted Attila's army. The battle ended without a decisive collapse on either side, but Attila's advance into Gaul was halted. A year later, Attila invaded Italy, but famine, disease, and negotiations involving Pope Leo convinced him to retreat. Attila died unexpectedly in 453, and his empire fragmented soon after, removing one of the West's most formidable threats. Yet despite Aetius's successes, political paranoia at the Western court proved fatal. In 454, CE Emperor Valentinian III assassinated Aetius in a fit of fear and misjudgment. A court official reportedly told the emperor after the murder, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." The remark captured the reality. Aetius had been the last figure capable of managing Rome's complex network of alliances and enemies. Within a year, Valentinian himself was assassinated, plunging the West deeper into disarray. The next decades saw emperors elevated and deposed with dizzying frequency, many serving only months. Powerful generals Ricimer Gundobad, Orestes placed puppet rulers on the throne while pursuing their own agendas. Meanwhile, the empire's provinces slipped away. Britain had long been abandoned to local rule. Gaul fractured under Visigothic, Burgundian, and Frankish influence. Spain fell under the Visigoths and Suebi. North Africa remained firmly Vandal. Into this fragmentation stepped Odoacer, a commander of mixed Germanic background who served within Rome's own armies. In 476 CE, he deposed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus. Instead of appointing a new Western emperor, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as king under nominal Eastern oversight. This moment is traditionally marked as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, though contemporaries saw it differently. Many Roman institutions continued. The Senate still met. Roman law still governed. Cities still functioned. The event was less a sudden collapse and more the final acknowledgement that Western imperial administration had already dissipated. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, endured. It weathered invasions, sustained its economy, improved its bureaucracy, and maintained stronger urban networks. Its diplomatic strategies, wealth, and fortified capital allowed it to survive long after the West crumbled. The Eastern Empire would later be called the Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants always identified as Romans Romaioi. Greek became its dominant language, Christianity its defining institution, and imperial authority its organizing principle. Why the East survived while the West fell remains a subject of deep debate. Explanations span geography, population, density, economic resources, political leadership, and differing threats. The East had richer provinces, stronger walls, and more defensible borders. It benefited from trade routes that fed Constantinople's treasury. It faced threats that, though serious, were often more manageable than the West's multi-front collapses. And crucially, its administrative reforms held more firmly. By the end of the 5th century, Western Europe had transitioned into a patchwork of successor kingdoms: Visigothic, Ostrogothic, Vandal, Frankish Burgundian, each blending Roman structures with local customs. Rome's political authority in the West had faded, but its cultural legacy endured. Latin persisted. Roman law influenced new legal codes. The Christian Church, rooted in Roman institutions, became a unifying force. Roads, aqueducts, and city layouts guided medieval development. The idea of Rome, its memory, its prestige, its universal aspirations, proved far more durable than the empire's political shell. The Western Empire had collapsed in 476 CE, but Rome itself, its identity, its institutions, its vision of order, did not die. It simply shifted eastward, gathering its strength behind the walls of Constantinople. What historians later call the Byzantine Empire was, in the eyes of its own citizens, the Roman Empire purified, strengthened, and retuned for new realities. Greek was its common tongue, Christianity, its unifying ideology, imperial ceremony, its political structure, and the dream of Roman universal rule, its quiet heartbeat. While the West splintered into successor kingdoms, struggling to define themselves, the East continued the long experiment of Roman governance, reshaping law, faith culture, foreign policy, and statecraft into something both familiar and radically new. In this final chapter, Rome's eternal legacy stretched beyond geopolitics into imagination itself, influencing Europe, the Middle East, and eventually the entire world. The early Eastern emperors, after 476, inherited a realm facing immense pressures but also immense strengths. Constantinople, protected by the massive Theodosian walls, stood as one of the best defended cities in the world. Its location straddling the Bosphorus made it a hub for trade routes, linking the Black Sea Mediterranean and Near East. The surviving Roman army in the East remained disciplined. Its administration, though strained, maintained taxation systems capable of supporting professional soldiers, and its leadership benefited from relative political continuity compared to the chaotic West. The Eastern court also became increasingly sophisticated in diplomacy, using marriage alliances, treaties, and strategic bribes as effectively as military force. But the empire's resilience would be tested repeatedly. The 6th century ushered in a dramatic attempt to restore Roman rule over the lost western provinces under Emperor Justinian I. Justinian, a ruler of tremendous ambition, sought not merely survival, but renewal. His reign, 527 to 565 CE, produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental legal codification that systematized centuries of Roman law into a coherent body. This compilation, Justinian's Code, became one of Rome's most influential legacies, shaping legal systems in medieval Europe and resonating through modern civil law traditions. Justinian also embarked on monumental building projects, none more famous than the Hagia Sophia, an architectural masterpiece whose vast dome became a symbol of the empire's spiritual and imperial aspirations. Militarily, Justinian pursued reconquest. Under the brilliant General Belisarius, The empire reclaimed North Africa from the Vandals in a swift campaign that astonished contemporaries. Italy proved far more difficult. The Gothic Wars dragged on for decades, devastating the peninsula and draining imperial resources. Though Rome was eventually retaken, the long struggle weakened both East and West. Justinian's ambitions outpaced the empire's long-term capacity, leaving successors to manage debts, depopulated territories, and overstretched frontiers. Yet his reign also affirmed something essential. Rome's legacy was not a static memory. It was an evolving project, capable of renewal when driven by extraordinary leadership. After Justinian, the empire endured new threats. The 7th century introduced one of the most significant turning points in its history, the rapid expansion of the Arab caliphates. Within a few decades, the Eastern Empire lost Egypt, Syria, and much of the Levant territories that had been among its wealthiest and most culturally influential. These losses forced a dramatic reorientation. With the empire's economic base reduced and its borders redefined, emperors implemented the theme system, reorganizing military and administrative units into regional commands that provided more flexible and resilient defense. This reform, though born of necessity, strengthened local readiness and helped the empire withstand future crises. The empire's identity also shifted. The late Roman world had blended Greek, Roman, Christian, and provincial cultures into a complex mosaic. The Byzantine era refined this mosaic into a distinct civilization with its own literary style, artistic aesthetics, theological intensity, and urban organization. Constantinople became a beacon for foreign travelers from Vikings to Persians, who marveled at its markets, palaces, and churches. The city's strategic diplomacy played enemies against one another, while its military innovations, including Greek fire, a fearsome incendiary weapon, kept invaders at bay. The empire survived sieges, rebellions, and dynastic changes, adapting continuously. In the 9th and 10th centuries, under rulers like Basil the Firm and Basil II, the empire experienced a resurgence. Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, expanded territory and restored fiscal discipline, ruling over a golden age of Byzantine power. Trade flourished, scholars preserved classical knowledge, and monasteries became centers of learning. While Western Europe navigated feudal fragmentation, the East remained a centralized state, capable of projecting influence from southern Italy to the Caucasus, yet history's rhythms always shift. The empire faced renewed pressure from the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century, culminating in the disastrous Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where Emperor Romanus IV was defeated and captured. The loss of Anatolia, the empire's heartland of manpower and agriculture, triggered internal strife and financial strain. Seeking help from Western Europe, Emperor Alexios IV Komnenos sparked the First Crusade, a movement that reshaped relations between East and West in ways no one fully anticipated. While the Crusaders helped recover some territory, their presence introduced both cooperation and deep mistrust. The tension reached tragedy in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade, when Latin crusaders sacked Constantinople, looting churches, destroying libraries, and carving the empire into Western-controlled states. This event, more than any earlier blow, shattered Byzantine economic networks and cultural continuity. Though the empire eventually re-established itself in 1261 under the Palaiologos dynasty, it never fully recovered its former strength. For 2 more centuries, Byzantium endured, shrinking, adapting, negotiating. But the rise of the Ottoman Turks gradually encircled the city. In 1453, after a prolonged siege, Sultan Mehmed II's forces breached Constantinople's walls. The last Roman emperor, Constantine V, died fighting on the ramparts. With the fall of the city, the Eastern Roman Empire, after more than 1,000 years of post-Western Rome survival, came to an end. And yet, just like in 476, the end of political power did not mark the end of Roman influence. Rome's legacy outlived its territorial control. It lived in Christian theology, shaped by councils and controversies across centuries. It lived in legal systems rooted in Justinian's codifications. It lived in the Latin alphabet, Romance languages, and the educational traditions that descended from classical models. It lived in art architecture, engineering, city planning, and infrastructure. It lived in the political imaginations of medieval rulers who claimed to revive empire, the Holy Roman Emperors, the Russian Tsars, the Ottoman Sultans, who called themselves Kaiser Caesars of Rome.